My name is Paul Lincoln, and I'm your host for Soil Matters, a podcast from the British Society of Soil Science, which is the professional body for soil scientists in the UK. Welcome to today's episode, and I'm delighted to welcome Lieutenant General Richard Nugee and Professor Jack Hannam. General Richard Nugee was commissioned into the British Army in 1986. He completed numerous operational tours and has specialised in personnel roles, both for the Army and Defence, culminating in the role of Chief of Defence People. As his final role, he wrote a review of Defence's approach to climate change and sustainability. He has since earned international recognition for bringing the implications of climate change and sustainability to defence and national security sectors. And he has expanded this policy interest into delivery as chair, director, and advisor for several renewable energy and environmental sustainability organisations. Richard, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Jack Hannam is well known to BSSS members and served as president from 2023 to 2024. Jack represented the sector on the global stage, and most recently, this was at COP29, the United Nations Climate Change Conference in Baku, and also COP17, the United Nations Convention to Combat Desertification, which took place in Riyadh. There, she led discussions on financing soil health. She has provided expert testimony before the House of Commons Select Committee on the parliamentary inquiry into soil health, as well as at the Canadian Senate, where she gave evidence to the Standing Committee on Agriculture and Forestry, in this case on their study into soil health. Jack also co-founded Soapbox Science in Milton Keynes, a platform showcasing female scientists and engaging the public in soil research. Jack helped create the world's first and most extensive soil archive, and most recently, she has joined the Natural Resources Institute at the University of Greenwich in September 2025, where she currently works as Head of Agriculture, Health and Environment Department. Jack, a warm welcome to you.
Thanks, Paul.
Now, today we're going to look at the impact of biodiversity loss and ecosystem collapse on national security. In The Guardian in January, there was an article which said, "The global attack on nature is threatening the UK's national security as there is increasingly likely collapse of vitally important natural systems would bring mass migration, food shortages, price rises, and global disorder." Now, this particular statement was prompted by the publication of a report by DEFRA called Nature Security Assessment on Global Biodiversity Loss, Ecosystem Collapse, and National Security. What this report shows is how environmental degradation can very easily disrupt food, water, health, and supply chains, and then trigger wider geopolitical instability. It identifies what it calls 7 judgments, one of which states, without significant increase in UK food system and supply chain resilience, it is unlikely that the UK would be able to maintain food security if ecosystem collapse drives geopolitical competition for food. Clearly a hugely important report, and this forms the basis of our discussion today. So I'd like to start with asking you a number of questions. The topic that we have just touched on has been a huge focus of your work, both before and since you left the Army. Tell us some of your areas of greatest concern.
I come from a defence and security perspective. I actually joined the Army at the age of 16, and so I've sort of lived almost my whole life committed to that organisation and take the security of this country very seriously, and as you said, have fought a number of times to maintain it. And so there's a piece here about how the defence can operate in a climate-changed world, but far more importantly to me is how is our security as a country affected by climate change and by biodiversity loss? So what I think this report has done is highlighted that there is at the very least, that there is a link. Actually, of course, it says far more than this, that there's a link between security, our national security. And what really keeps me, if you like, up at night is how is our security as a country affected by biodiversity loss, by climate change, as much as affected by what Russia might be doing to NATO and so on. What's the look of that is, does the country start to degrade? Does it start to collapse? Does it start to turn in on itself because of issues which are being caused by biodiversity loss and climate change? And I think that there is an argument to say, and I have made this argument, that some of the things that are happening as a result of biodiversity loss have the potential to really unsettle the country to the point of disruption of a lot of what we do today. And so that's my concern. I want to live in a peaceful country, a successful country, a country that's worth defending, frankly. And I think that biodiversity loss is undermining that.
Was the report telling you anything that you think that we did not already know? Was there a kind of sensational value to it?
There's a sensational value to it on a number of scores, I think. The first is who wrote the report. It wasn't DEFRA, it was the Joint Intelligence Committee. And the Joint Intelligence Committee is the top intelligence committee that gives its advice to the National Security Council, right at the top of the intelligence pyramid. The very fact that that report was written by the Joint Intelligence Committee rather than by another government department is significant. It is extremely significant. So that has a wow factor all of its own, in my view. What it actually said, certainly the version that was published, I don't think there's much new in that to those who really understand, but they put it in very stark language. And I think that's important. Language matters. And I think that saying that every ecosystem is a threat of collapse and so on is a very stark way of presenting the facts. And actually, the unpublished report goes even further, as I understand. And so it's sort of more of the same, but it absolutely isn't more of the same because of who wrote it and how they've written it.
We'll come back to that in a moment in more detail, but also I'm aware that a national risk register is published every year covering a wide range of issues. To what extent does that more traditional form of risk assessment include the kind of biodiversity loss items that you've talked about?
Well, I actually did I got the most recent National Risk Register up and did a word search. I read it, but actually I did a word search. It's a long document. And I put in food security as a word search, not mentioned once. I put biodiversity loss in the word search, not mentioned once. And I put food in, and that's mentioned a number of times, but mostly as part of the title of DEFRA. It mentioned food as a risk, as a specific scenario. So in other words, it actually hasn't registered on the National Risk Register yet, that this is a national risk and a national security concern. And I think that is going to change. I was massively impressed that the King, who gave the amazing speech to Congress and to the White House, the King did not pull his punches when it came to this. And he said that, we should be concerned about a national security risk that comes from depleting nature. That's biodiversity loss in another name. And I think that the very fact that the King had the courage to say that in Congress, I think is really important because it shows that at the top levels of our thinking as a government and as an organization, as an institution, if you like, we are saying that this is a national security issue, but it's not yet on the National Risk Register.
And how do you, I don't know who obviously compiles the risk register, but how do you get that risk register to take this topic seriously?
Well, it's a question, as I understand it, and I'm not an expert, but as I understand it, it's about the departments all put in their risks. It is assessed by the National Security Council, and the National Security Council will take into account the reports that it's had, as well as the reports from ministries, and will then make a judgment on what the national risks are. And so I think that given that this report has been produced, it's probably been produced after the latest edition of the National Risk Register, that actually we would see some change in the National Risk Register as a result of this report. That's what I would hope to see.
Jack, you're waving your hand. You wanted to make a comment here.
Yeah, it's really great stuff from Richard. Absolutely. I think, I just wanted to come in on the, I guess, on the sort of risk register. So there are kind of different elements to this. So the National Risk Register is really it was designed really to look at what we call like something like acute risks. So these are things that need like an emergency response. So a big fire, a terrorist attack, someone kidnapping the Prime Minister, these sorts of things. So I was doing a little bit of exactly the same thing as Richard, thinking, well, where are these, what we would call more like chronic risks? So things like biodiversity loss, climate change, things that have extreme events and things like this. We have those sorts of things that climate change is producing some of these extreme climatic risks that we have to respond to. But these sort of more chronic things in terms of longer term biodiversity loss don't appear on the risk register. So there is another piece of work that's done in government that is identifying these chronic risks, and biodiversity loss is in there. So I'm not sure, again, there's maybe a bit of sleuthing to do. It's like, is this done in response to that report? Did that come after or before? So there are obviously things happening behind the scenes, and not a lot of it is out in the public domain yet. So some of those chronic risks are identified as, climate change, biodiversity loss in particular are mentioned in those, including things like environmental degradation and pollution as well as other more chronic risks around sort of terrorism and security, which are not those, I guess, sort of immediate acute things that are on the National Risk Register. So it does seem to be a bit of joining up, hopefully. Maybe I'm being too optimistic.
There's one other piece, which is I'm sort of linked into the National Resilience Council, or actually a council doesn't exist, but the National Resilience sort of movement and National Preparedness Commission. And here they absolutely do recognise this as an issue. In order for this country to be resilient, and I could talk for ages about that, in order for this country to be resilient, food security is a very big part of that. And we might come back to that, Paul. But I think there's aspects of how this links into resilience against all sorts of threats. Biodiversity loss being a threat, Russia being a threat, if you want to name an aggressor, supply chains being damaged being a threat, etc., etc., etc.
You've argued that many governments treat climate and security as completely separate priorities. And you've argued that true security will depend on how quickly we integrate climate resilience into national defence. What has to happen? What's the best way forward for this?
There's two aspects from a sort of security perspective. One is we need our armed forces to both understand what climate change and biodiversity loss produces and react to it and adapt to it, but also to take the great opportunities that are available from some of the technologies that are trying to ameliorate and mitigate against climate change. So when I started this particular sort of adventure with my report, most militaries put their head in the sand and said, this is nothing to do with us. In fact, I was told we're exempt climate change a couple of times by some very senior people. And the first time I didn't have a response. The second time was, oh, so we're exempt the world, are we? It's happening to us whether we like it or not. And defence has now, certainly the UK defence, but I think a lot of defence organisations around the world have now embraced this as, yes, okay, we need to understand it, we need to adapt to it, and we need to take opportunity of some of the new technologies. So that's all very, very good. That's one side of it. But actually, resilience comes in two forms. I talk about a spear. Forgive me, it's a military analogy, of course, but a spear, a Roman spear or something like that, had a very, very finely tuned, extremely lethal tip that was metal and had a long shaft that was wood. And in a sense, this is a really good analogy. The armed forces are the tip of the spear. They are the extremely sophisticated, extremely lethal tip of the spear, the metal bit. But without a shaft, it's pretty much useless. You need the shaft. And what is the shaft? The shaft is the homeland resilience that supports the armed forces if you are at war. And more importantly, it supports the community and the public, or if you like, the nation, whilst the tip of the spear is away fighting. And this is something that actually is really, really important. And actually framing it in these terms, it is not new. NATO has framed it in these terms ever since it was first, its articles were first written. It happens to be NATO Article 3, which most people don't know about. But it basically says you've got to have a resilient homeland to have a resilient armed. And so we're in this position of we need to build resilience at home. And that's where actually understanding biodiversity loss, understanding what it means to our food security, understanding what it means to our farmers is just as important as it is sort of spending money on defence and so on. And I think that framing, which is becoming more to the fore now, not least because we seem to be in a much more volatile world, is something that we had forgotten. Basically, you have to be over the age of 40 to understand, or to have not understand necessarily, but have lived in a country that was geared around it, because we lost all of that in from sort of 1989 onwards. I think that's coming back. It must come back.
Should world leaders therefore redefine what security means? Would that change of definition help?
I think they are redefining it as we speak. You hear regularly now people talking about energy security. You hear more frequently people talking about food security. You hear people talking about water security. Security isn't just the armed forces, and I think that's a movement that has developed over the last years, months, I don't know, but I think it is being redefined. It's it's actually going back to what it was. It's not going back to something brand new. Security used to be the security of the entirety of the nation, not just allowing our forces to fight, go away and fight. We are in an extraordinary country in the United Kingdom. We have not had a hostile invasion for nearly 1,000 years. We are completely unused to aggression on our soil and threats to our soil. And by soil, I mean our nation in this respect. We're unique in Europe. We're the only country that hasn't been invaded in Europe over that period of time. And so we find it exceptionally hard to understand this. When you speak to the French, you speak to the Germans, you speak to the Polish, you speak to the Norwegians, they can remember very clearly people being on their soil. And so security is much more than just an armed forces that happens to play away in some foreign land. It's not our understanding, but it is absolutely the understanding of everybody else in Europe.
And do you think that, as clearly the government has made a commitment to increase defence spending, does it look as if this increase in resources will focus on these wider issues or focus only on conventional military spending?
Well, I thought it was quite clever when NATO turned around and said, we'll reach 5%, but 3.5% will be on the armed forces and 1.5% on everything else. And so I would hope that 1.5% is very clearly steered towards energy security, food security, water security, and so on, the very basics of life. There is a danger, of course, that 1.5% could be spent on, you can justify anything if you really want to under the terms of security. And a lot of people have talked about individual personal security being, and I wouldn't go quite that far, or the security of, particular sects of society. I wouldn't necessarily go down that far to talk about national security. That 1.5% should be trying to make sure that we are resilient in a national security perspective, but 3.5% going to the military. Just as an aside, at the end of the Cold War, the percentage of GDP that we were spending on our armed forces was about 4%. So we've done this before, and we've actually done it in a country that has a welfare state before. It's a question of priorities, and I'm not a politician. They have to work out the priorities that will work, but that is where we have been in the past.
And as we've been looking back a little bit, I was interested to just reflect on the Dig for Victory campaign during the Second World War. Do you think there are lessons from that or reminders that we should be considering at the moment?
I did a bit of research on this because I didn't know as much about. I've seen the posters. Obviously, I was born only a few years after rationing stopped, and so I was born much closer to the Second World War than we are today from the turn of the millennium. It was a very present issue for my parents, both of whom lived through the Second World War. So Dig for Victory is something that I have been brought up on, but didn't really understand. And when you look at the figures, it is extraordinary. We were importing in 1938, so before the war, we were importing 70 to 75% of all our foodstuffs. That is now lower. Already, we're back down to sort of 40 to 45%. Some foodstuffs, of course, it's 100%. We just can't grow them in this country, but there's a lot more growth. Farmers were given a really clear direction after the Second World War. You go for yield at all costs. Now, that is costing us now, but the direction was really clear. We can never be in a position where we have to do Dig for Victory again because we're not more resilient from our farming. But actually, what did it do? And I think that here we really can learn lessons. It was about building community. It was about connecting people, particularly in the urban environment, to where food comes from, because they were all aware of it. You had seed banks being set up in most villages. You had community lectures and sort of points of interest where people would learn about what's the best way of growing carrots or growing potatoes or whatever it is. And also there's real benefits. It reduced people's bills. It gave them a sense of community. It gave them a sense of agency. They were part of the effort, even if they were on the front line. That sense of agency, I would say, has almost completely disappeared from our country, and we need to get back to it. So having something similar, very different, of course, but it can never be the same vocabulary, but the concept of community engagement in creating food, community engagement in a sense of agency that they're helping do their bit. Nutrition was another side of it. People like eating. If they're going to put back-breaking work into creating food, they tend to eat it rather than throw it away. Because it's their effort that has gone. We're too used to getting everything from a supermarket, which of course didn't exist in those days. So I think there is real opportunity to think of a similar sort of event or a similar approach. There was a lasting legacy. It was a much bigger allotments movement as a result of Dig for Victory, and quite a lot of sort of community gardens and things like that, all that sort of, if not originated, but massively spurred by Dig for Victory. I think we've lost so much of that, and we can get back to it.
That's a really helpful comment. Jack, I wonder if you would like to comment on this sense of community engagement, because I think it overlaps with work that you've been involved in. At what point does caring for the soil and developing community coalesce?
Yeah, it's absolutely vital, actually. If we want to kind of think about restoring some of our degraded kind of ecosystems and soils, we need to kind of return to that kind of care aspect, really, about individuals actually responding to being able to nurture, grow food in those sorts of ecosystems. And we've been very removed, exactly like Richard said, from particularly around food production, about where these items that appear on the supermarket shelves actually come from, and what the process is of actually growing those things. They don't just suddenly appear wrapped in cellophane. You have to understanding that kind of whole ecosystem, the soil, and those sorts of things are really important to kind of like reconnect us both with soils, but also nature as well. So we're talking about a broader kind of concept of biodiversity loss, but being able to kind of interact with the species, with the soil, in an environment that is led by a kind of, more like a kind of community response. So if you are, caring about those things, you'll start to look after them. So it's a kind of positive sort of feedback loop, if you like.
Thank you. And let me, if we go back to the report that we were talking about, Jack, what are your thoughts on the significance of this report?
Yeah, so again, quite similar to Richard, and I was really captured by the language as well. This wasn't written, so interestingly, I hadn't realised actually it was written by the Joint Intelligence Committee, which is really crucial. But this wasn't written by a newspaper. This was like, headlines that you might see in some of the newspapers, and this was written by the government. So this echoes really the significance and importance of this, really, that it is something that we need to be kind of sitting up and paying attention to. And the thing that, again, is about sort of connecting these things together. So some of these risks have quite often been discussed or seen in isolation, but really starting to look at the connection between, biodiversity loss and the interaction with climate change and all of the cascading risks that manifest from those sorts of things. So really starting to connect that whole system together. That was really something that was refreshing to kind of see. I mean, again, looking at some of the uncertainties as well. So obviously being, quite stark in terms of responding to, we may be close or further away from particular thresholds of ecosystem collapse. And it was quite clear, in some of those that we may be close to what we would call a tipping point in some areas. Actually identifying, I think there were 6 ecosystems around the world. So really being very specific. So we talk quite a lot about general terms about global biodiversity loss or ecosystems, but being very specific about the sorts of areas that are having those kind of cascading impacts. So they highlighted the Amazon, the boreal forests, the coral reefs. So these areas that they feel play an important role in our kind of whole ecosystem, if you like, that cascades all of those risks through, but also those that potentially approaching these sorts of tipping points. And if they start to, go over these sorts of thresholds, there's going to be really significant changes in terms of, the impacts on national security. In particular, that was the focus on the report, but also lots of other things as well.
And if we can add to this, a further report published in April highlights the farming industry's reliance on artificial fertilizer. And that reliance on artificial fertilizer has obviously been highlighted by the impact of the blockade on the Straits of Hormuz. There's a lot of different questions to look at here, but what do you think are the alternatives to using artificial fertilizer?
Gosh, that is a very big question, Paul.
Yes.
If I had my little magic wand, this would be fantastic. I mean, we can't get away from the fact that 50% of the global population at the moment is fed by crops grown with artificial fertilizers. And as Richard alluded to, post-war, we had this in the UK at least, focus on kind of national security and food security in particular. So this was then, response to those sorts of crises. So this has been happening. Population has also completely exploded since that time. And one way of being able to do that, is to then enhance the yields of the crops that we grow through additional fertilizers. So there is still, this question has always come, could we grow the same amount of food if we completely remove that from the system? I don't think we can, but there are opportunities to find kind of alternatives. So thinking about more like a kind of a circular economy, thinking about things that are nutrient rich. Lots of waste that we produce, from things like wastewater treatment, for example, those sorts of things that can then kind of be returned to land using more kind of organic forms of fertilizers, thinking about, going back to the Dig for Victory, your compost heap on the allotment, you're returning that organic matter back into the soil again. So thinking about this sort of circularity. Because what's happened in sort of industrial agriculture is like, we are basically removing all of those nutrients from the soils because the plants are really good at sucking those out. That's what they need to grow. But we're not returning that matter back into the system again. So we're constantly kind of depleting it. And one way that we're replacing that is through synthetic, nitrogen and phosphorus and things like this. So there are alternatives that we can use where we can start to think about, returning some of that organic matter to the land, thinking about alternative forms of fertilizers. And then, there's always that what if the next breakthrough. So, we had this breakthrough in the Haber-Bosch process, which basically, could make these synthetic fertilizers in the 1950s. Is there a new process that we can do that isn't maybe necessarily as reliant on fossil fuels to do that process either? That we could, is there something in the future that we could use? We there's a whole can of worms we could open, I guess, around the sort of debate around sort of genetically modified crops that can synthesize their own nitrogen. Legumes do this very well themselves. But people are looking at, well, could you start to think about breeding things like, staple crops like wheat that have this capacity to actually take nitrogen from the atmosphere, like a leguminous plant would do. So there's kind of, near things we can do, further things afield that are kind of more perhaps in, the R&D realm that we can start to think about to bring in into that process.
And are there two tracks that we're looking either about producing food without fertilizer at all, or that we're looking at alternative forms of fertilizer? I mean, is it worth distinguishing between that?
Well, yeah, I guess the distinguishing thing is synthetic fertilizer. So you could have something that is actually quite a natural product that you would call a sort of like a compost in a way. It is a fertilizer, but it's formed from different things. So I think trying to sit on the fence a bit, then having this balance between reducing our reliance on fertilizers for whole different reasons, as you said, now that from the point of view of the kind of geopolitical context that's happening, but also in fact in terms of trying to improve the soil conditions as well by integrating some of these more kind of natural fertilizers into those systems.
If we look at soil health specifically and national security, how well is soil health monitored from a national security point of view?
I don't know whether it's funny, isn't it, that then again, this is the link that the report makes between biodiversity loss and national security. We think of it in terms of maybe food security rather than a broader piece around sort of national security, I guess. So in terms of the soil monitoring, we're looking in the UK in particular. So there are different kind of schemes, but DEFRA are currently running a monitoring program. So they have developed these indicators for soil health. And rather than looking at, the different sorts of characteristics that you can measure in soil, like the pH, the amount of nitrogen, the carbon, all these sorts of things individually, is actually putting them together in terms of saying, okay, so we want this soil to do something for us. And that actually might be growing food. So is that soil in a healthy state for us to continue, for that soil to have the capacity to continue growing food, or equally, it's quite good at storing carbon. So where are we in terms of like its capacity to store carbon or filter water? So these sorts of if you like, services, which are a kind of national security thing as well, are being kind of developed in the monitoring scheme as well. So they haven't made the explicit link, but I think in the way that they're approaching the monitoring, that that at the moment there is a sort of implicit move towards rather than getting very involved in the nitty gritty, which some of us academics are quite good at doing, and the deep dive of exactly what we should be measuring in this particular species that's there. But actually, what is the system doing in terms of delivering those sorts of things that are important for national security, like flood prevention and food production and climate mitigation through carbon sequestration.
And I've got a question which I'd like to ask of both of you. So start with you, Jack. In terms of, our conversation so far has been about UK national security and the impact of climate emergency. What is your sense of how other countries, or indeed how the UN and others, are treating this subject? Are there different approaches in your experience? Because you've been to a number of UN COPs recently. To what extent is the debate about security on those agendas?
Again, I don't. I'm just trying to think back to some of the conversations we were having at COP. I think there is a difference depending on how those particular countries are affected by those issues, for example. So we're looking at certain areas of the world that are experiencing, the UK at the moment, but more extreme responses to climate change, for example. So we're starting to see some migration happening in some countries because some areas now are becoming uninhabitable, either through extreme heat or water scarcity. So you're starting to see a response, like in some areas of the world where these things are actually starting to play out. They're being discussed in the report from the UK government, but they're actually starting to play out in some of these areas. So I think it's very regionalised, depending on the they're a response now to an acute risks that is happening in those areas. I'm not sure. Maybe Richard's got a better idea of a broader sort of view in terms of, I guess, a sort of UN perspective. I don't know whether that is being considered at a broader kind of level.
Richard, your observations on international approaches.
I think it's quite interesting that I've been asked to be the security and defence person on an organisation which was only set up in the last 12 to 18 months called Soil Stars. They are very international. Actually, there aren't that many UK members of the Soil Stars. There are quite a lot of American scientists. It's mostly very sophisticated soil scientists and academics from sort of all over the world. But the point is, it's from all over the world. And I sort of pale into insignificance when they're speaking most of the time. There's a sort of so I think there is a growing understanding that soil is a finite entity that needs to be looked after. That's probably nothing new to Jack, but is starting to raise its head, and that they have explicitly, by asking me to be part of it, they've explicitly expressed a link internationally that there is a security aspect to this. But I think that, I don't have much more experience than that. The UN, I don't think I've seen anything from the UN that would emphasize that. And there's a lot of pushback in various parts of the world saying this is, you're conflating issues and it's all rubbish sort of thing. But you get pushback on anything like this at the moment. But on a slightly different tangent, one of the things I've been supporting for the past 25 years probably is what's now called the Great Green Wall, which is absolutely an international idea of trying to preserve soil by and reduce the aspects of conflict that might come from exactly what Jack was talking about, by producing literally a wall of trees south of the Sahara to try and make sure that the Sahara doesn't carry on south and destroy people's livelihoods in terms of agriculture. It's a massive project across the whole of Africa. It's really ambitious. I've been paying my £5 every month to try and help it, sort of thing, for years and years and years. But I was interested, just as an aside, that there was an advert for it just recently, which I haven't seen before. In other words, it is starting to become a thing that people recognize. So I think there is international understanding. There is absolutely international understanding that if you destroy the ability to grow food, either through drought or through weaponizing water, which some non-state actors do, that has an effect on migration and it has an effect on people's ability to live and their livelihoods, and that which is why it's being weaponized. Food and water are being weaponized. That is really clear to be a security or have a security aspect to it.
Thank you. And I've got one closing question that I want to ask both of you, and I'll start with you, Jack. This podcast, our audience, it's an audience of soil scientists as soil science students. What's their role in all of this, Jack?
I guess it's a call to action to all of you, I guess, really. Yes. So this is it, absolutely. And I think this is it, soils is climbing up the agenda. In fact, it's front and center in many places now that, is, I guess, from the point of view, also from the society, is we're kind of, we're evidence led. So the kind of research and things that we're doing, that we're involved with, that, clearly have these applications in a very broad context, is actually to start to think about the sort of work that you're doing and the angles that it has into kind of national security, these kind of like global issues. Not to get, too bogged down with the minutiae, but actually to realize that this has really quite global significance, the kind of work that we're doing as soil scientists. And, we need more of us around the world to understand this kind of system, to be able to start to think about, well, what's the sorts of things that we can put in place to start to sort of restore those kind of soil systems and ecosystems and the global population that relies on soils, essentially.
Thank you. So Richard, your suggestions to members of the society, please.
I love the concept that we're evidence-led. I just wish it was so all the time. I think there's two things that the society could do. The first is to really, in apologies, really dumbed down language, bring the concept of why soil matters to the general public. Not highfalutin science, but really, really basic stuff. And the fact that it is not infinite. You can't just continue taking stuff out of the soil for generations and generations without putting some stuff back in. You know, that there's this sense that it's completely infinite, and it doesn't matter what you do to the soil, it'll still produce food, and it'll still be the highest quality food that you've ever thought of. You know, it's just not true. And so getting that message out and connecting soil to food and food quality, I think at a really basic level is something that the society could do. And then there's one other thing that which is slightly more sort of academic, if you like, is to find the science that turns around and says, if you do this to the soil, you will get X result. If you do that to the soil, you'll get Y result. And you could do the same, or you could do sort of comparisons with similar soil types and things like that. So prove through evidence that there are better ways and less good ways of dealing with soil. And it's a really simple concept. Because again, I think the general public's view, and certainly my view as a complete Luddite, is, well, it doesn't matter what you do, the soil's going to produce the same thing. No, there's a real art to this. There's a real science to this. And I think what we need to do is make that abundantly clear that there are good practices and less good practices. Interestingly, Dig for Victory, and I'll finish with this, Dig for Victory, one of the things I learned is about how to plant carrots. They took as an example, one local council took it as an example, 2 rows of carrots, one that were really closely seeded together. So you got lots and lots and lots and lots of carrots. And then you got one that was slightly more sparsely planted. The one that had slightly more sparsely planted carrots produced far better carrots and greater quantity of food. One that was really closely seeded produced spindly little things because they were all competing. They did a practical example, 2 rows next door to each other, to prove to people that there is a better way of doing it and a less good way of doing it. And I think some of that, it's not difficult science, it's practical, it's visual. Look at the carrots that come out of this row, look at the carrots that come out of that row. That sort of thing is where the soil scientists could really help bring it to life for the general public.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So a huge thanks to Richard Nugee and to Jack Hannam. Thank you very much indeed for your fascinating contribution today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Paul.
Hi, my name is Professor Jack Hannam, and I'm a soil scientist, and I'm past president of the British Society of Soil Science. Did you know the health of our soil affects everything? Our food, our climate, our health, and our future. Formed in 1947, the British Society of Soil Science is a professional membership body dedicated to protecting, improving, and discovering new knowledge about the foundation of our planet, soil. From developing cutting-edge research, engaging with international and domestic governments through science-led policy and advocacy, to publishing in leading sector journals, and accessing extensive educational resources, our members are given the tools to be at the forefront of shaping a sustainable future. Our members are central to making a real impact and facilitating lasting change. Through access to our extensive networks, they could connect with experts and drive the conversation on soil health worldwide. Join a passionate community committed to tackling the future generational climate, biodiversity and food security challenges. Don't wait, get involved today, because soil is where it all begins, and soil matters now more than ever. Find out more at soils.org.uk.